The night my son looked at me across the dinner table and said, "You eat here for free," something inside me didn't break. It went silent. Not angry, not shocked, just clear. Because in that moment, I realized I was no longer seen as family. I was a cost. So I smiled, stood up, and made one quiet phone call. He thought I would sign whatever he placed in front of me. He thought I wouldn't ask questions. He was wrong. And what happened next changed everything I thought I knew about trust, family, and respect. Before we dive into today's story, take a moment to share where you're watching from. We love seeing how our stories bring people together from every corner of the world. Your thoughts and comments are what make this community so special, and we're truly grateful to have you here. If you haven't already, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story filled with drama, resilience, and unexpected twists. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and maybe grab your favorite drink because this is a tale you won't want to miss. Let's get started. My name is Margaret Ellis. I am 70 years old, and for most of my life, I was the kind of woman who took care of other people before I ever thought about taking care of myself. I spent over 40 years working as a nurse in Charleston, South Carolina, moving through long shifts, quiet hospital halls, and moments that required patience more than recognition. It was a life built on routine, responsibility, and the quiet understanding that stability mattered more than anything else. My husband, Thomas Ellis, believed that even more strongly than I did. He was a former United States Navy officer, the kind of man who never left anything unplanned. Where I relied on instinct and care, he relied on structure and preparation. Together, we built a life that was not extraordinary in appearance, but deeply steady at its core. We owned a coastal home not far from the water, a small rental property that provided extra income, and a set of investments Thomas monitored with careful attention. He always said security was not something you hoped for. It was something you built slowly, piece by piece. When Thomas became ill, the structure he had spent a lifetime creating began to feel fragile for the first time. His illness moved slowly, giving us time to prepare in practical ways, but not enough time to prepare emotionally. After he passed, the house we had shared for decades changed in ways I could not have imagined. Nothing inside it was different, yet everything felt altered. The same furniture stood in the same places, the same windows let in the same light, but the silence carried a weight that followed me from room to room. Grief did not arrive loudly for me. It did not demand attention. Instead, it settled quietly into my daily routines. Mornings became slower. Evenings felt longer. Small habits, like making coffee for two or setting the television to the programs we used to watch together, turned into reminders of absence. Over time, the house no longer felt like a place of comfort. It felt like a place filled with echoes. That was when my son Daniel began calling more often. At first, his concerns sounded like what any son might feel. He asked how I was sleeping, whether I was eating properly, whether I felt safe being alone. His voice carried a calm practicality that reminded me of his father. He spoke about things that made sense: the cost of maintaining a large home, the unpredictability of emergencies, the reality of getting older. He never pressured me directly. Instead, he offered solutions. He suggested that I consider moving closer to him, to his home in Mount Pleasant, where he lived with his wife, Rebecca, and their young daughter. He explained that I would not have to worry about managing the house, that I would have company, that I would be part of a more active daily life. Rebecca supported the idea, describing how there would be space for me and how the transition could be easy. At first, I resisted. The house I lived in was not simply a building. It held decades of shared experiences, memories that could not be replaced. Leaving it felt like letting go of something permanent. But loneliness has a way of shifting the meaning of things. Over time, the quiet became heavier than the attachment. Eventually, I agreed. The process moved quickly after that. Daniel took responsibility for handling the details. He communicated with agents, organized paperwork, and explained each step in a way that made everything feel simple. I trusted him completely. When documents needed signatures, I signed them. When decisions needed to be made, I deferred to him. It felt natural to rely on him, especially during a time when everything else in my life felt uncertain. When the house was sold, the proceeds, along with my existing financial assets, were placed under Daniel's management. He assured me it would make things easier, that I would not have to worry about anything. At the time, that sounded like relief. Moving into his home in Mount Pleasant felt like stepping into a different life. The house was larger, newer, and filled with activity. My granddaughter greeted me with excitement, pulling me into her world without hesitation. Rebecca walked me through the routines of the house, explaining how things were organized. Daniel made sure my room was comfortable and easy to access. In those first days, everything felt welcoming. The silence that had once filled my home was replaced with movement, conversation, and presence. I told myself I had made the right decision. What I did not realize then was that while I had changed my address, something else had changed with it. My role, my independence, and the quiet boundaries of my life had already begun to shift in ways I had not yet learned to see. If you're still watching and feel something isn't quite right yet, comment one below so I know you're paying attention, because what seems small in the beginning is about to turn into something much bigger. Now let's move on to Chapter 2. Life in Daniel's house settled into a rhythm faster than I expected. Mornings began early, filled with the quiet urgency of school preparations, coffee brewing, and the sound of footsteps moving from one room to another. It was a different kind of life from the one I had known. My old home had been defined by silence and routine. This one was structured, active, and constantly in motion. At first, the change felt comforting. The presence of my granddaughter brought a kind of warmth I had not realized I was missing. She would sit beside me in the evenings, showing me her schoolwork, or talking about small details of her day that seemed important to her. Those moments felt genuine, untouched by the quiet adjustments happening elsewhere in the house. Rebecca managed everything with a level of precision that reminded me of my husband, though her approach felt different. Where Thomas had been careful, she was controlled. The kitchen, in particular, seemed to operate under a system I did not fully understand. She kept track of groceries, organized storage in a specific way, and preferred that meals followed a routine she had already established. At first, her comments seemed harmless. She would mention how things were usually done, or how certain items were meant to be used. When I prepared something simple for my granddaughter, she would gently correct me, suggesting I check with her next time. I adjusted without question. It was her home, after all. I reminded myself that adapting was part of living with others. Over time, those small corrections became more frequent. I found myself pausing before doing things that once came naturally. I hesitated before opening cabinets, before using appliances, even before preparing food. It was not that I had been told I could not do these things. It was that I had begun to feel I should not do them without asking. Daniel, meanwhile, grew quieter. He was often present but rarely engaged. Even during meals, his attention drifted toward his phone or laptop. Our conversations became shorter, reduced to brief exchanges that never seemed to go beyond the surface. I told myself he was busy. That explanation was easy to accept. I tried to be helpful in ways that would not interfere. I folded laundry, organized small things around the house, and spent time with my granddaughter whenever I could. She responded with the same affection she had shown from the beginning. That consistency became something I quietly relied on. But there were other changes, subtle ones that were harder to ignore. Rebecca began mentioning household expenses more often, not directly to me, but in conversations that happened close enough for me to hear. Groceries, utilities, the cost of maintaining a household with more people. The words were practical, but their placement felt intentional. I told myself not to take it personally. Families discussed finances. That was normal. Still, something about the repetition of those conversations made me more aware of my presence in the house in a way I had not been before. The shift became clear one evening at dinner. We were all seated at the table, the usual routine in place. My granddaughter spoke about school. Rebecca mentioned something about work, and Daniel listened with the same distant attention he had shown for weeks. Then the conversation turned, as it often did, toward expenses. Daniel leaned back slightly in his chair, his tone calm and controlled. He said, "Mom, you eat for free here." No one reacted immediately. The words did not sound harsh in the way they were delivered. That was what made them settle so deeply. My granddaughter lowered her eyes. Rebecca gave a brief, uncertain response that did not quite reach the level of disagreement. I felt something inside me grow very still. I did not respond. I did not question him or defend myself. Instead, I finished what was on my plate, stood up quietly, and excused myself from the table. My movements were calm, measured, as if nothing unusual had happened. In the hallway, away from the sound of the house, I stopped for a moment. The silence there felt different from the silence I had known before. This one carried clarity. Humiliation does not always arrive with raised voices. Sometimes it comes quietly, wrapped in ordinary words that reveal something you had not wanted to see. I reached into my pocket and took out my phone. For a brief moment, I considered waiting, giving myself time to think. But I already knew what I needed to do. When the call connected, I spoke in a steady voice. "I think it is time." I ended the call without saying anything more, and in that moment, something shifted. If you're starting to sense the shift happening beneath the surface, comment 2 below to let me know you're with me, because the next moment will reveal the first real crack in trust. Now let's move on to chapter 3. The morning after my phone call, nothing in the house appeared different. The same sounds filled the kitchen, the same routines unfolded in their usual order, and yet something inside me had shifted in a way I could not ignore. I moved through the day as I normally would, but I was no longer simply living in that house. I was observing it. For the first time since I had arrived in Mount Pleasant, I began to notice patterns. Small things, things I had dismissed before, now carried weight. One of those things was the mailbox. Every afternoon, sometime between 3:30 and 4, the mail carrier passed through our street. I had heard the sound often enough to recognize it without looking. But I had also noticed something else. By the time I made my way outside, the mailbox was almost always empty. At first, I had assumed Daniel was simply checking it earlier. It seemed harmless, but now I began to pay attention. That day, I positioned myself near the front window just before the usual time. When the mail truck slowed at the curb, I watched carefully. A few minutes later, I stepped outside. The mailbox door was already closed. Inside, there was nothing. That happened again the next day, and the day after that. Each time, Daniel arrived home with the same casual tone when I asked about it. He said, "Nothing important came." The words sounded simple, but the repetition began to feel deliberate. It was not what he said. It was how easily he dismissed the question. I did not confront him. Not yet. Instead, I waited. A few days later, the opportunity came without warning. Daniel was still at work, and Rebecca had taken my granddaughter out for an afternoon activity. The house was quiet in a way I had not experienced since moving in. When I heard the familiar sound of the mail truck, I moved quickly. This time, I reached the mailbox first. Inside were 3 envelopes. One was a local advertisement. Another was addressed to Rebecca. The third one had my name on it. I recognized the return address immediately. It was from a financial institution connected to accounts Thomas and I had used for years. I held the envelope for a moment before opening it. It felt heavier than ordinary mail, not physically, but in a way I could not fully explain. Inside was a statement. At first, the information seemed routine. Numbers, account references, structured details that did not immediately make sense without context. But as I read more carefully, one line drew my attention. A pending transaction. The amount listed beside it was not small. It was significant enough to affect everything Thomas and I had spent a lifetime building. I stood there in the driveway, trying to recall when I had authorized any such transfer. I could not remember anything. Not recently. Not at all. A quiet unease settled over me. I folded the document carefully and slipped it into my pocket just as a car turned onto the street. Rebecca's vehicle pulled into the driveway moments later. I forced my expression to remain neutral as she stepped out. She asked if anything had come in the mail. I said there had not. The lie felt unfamiliar, but necessary. That evening, I watched Daniel more closely than I ever had before. He behaved as he always did, distracted, calm, moving through the house without hesitation. There was no sign of concern in his expression. After dinner, I approached him in the living room. I asked about the accounts in a neutral tone, careful not to reveal what I knew. He confirmed he was handling everything and assured me there was nothing I needed to worry about. Then he used the same phrase again. It is taken care of. I nodded, but something inside me no longer accepted that answer. Later that night, I sat alone in my room with the statement spread out in front of me. The numbers were clearer now. The transfer had not yet been completed. That meant there was still time. I thought about Thomas, about the way he had always insisted on understanding every detail before making a decision. I had trusted Daniel without question. Now, for the first time, I questioned that trust. And once that question existed, it refused to disappear. If you can feel the tension building and wonder where this is leading, comment 3 below so I know you're still here. Because what she discovers next will change how she sees everything. Now, let's move on to Chapter 4. The day after I found the bank statement, I moved through the house as if nothing had changed. On the surface, that was true. Breakfast was prepared, the morning unfolded as it always did, and the quiet structure of the household remained intact. But internally, something had shifted in a way that could not be undone. I spent most of that morning thinking, not about what I had seen, but about everything I had not seen. For months, I had trusted Daniel to manage my finances. I had not reviewed a single statement, not questioned a single decision, not asked for clarification on anything he handled. At the time, it had felt reasonable. I had been grieving, overwhelmed, and ready to hand responsibility to someone I believed I could rely on. Now, that decision looked different. I began retracing events in my mind, small moments that had seemed insignificant before, documents I had signed without reading closely, conversations that had ended too quickly, the repeated reassurance that everything was taken care of. Each memory felt slightly altered when viewed through the lens of what I now knew. Grief had made things easier for them. That thought came quietly, without anger, but with a clarity that settled deeply. I considered confronting Daniel immediately. The idea surfaced more than once throughout the day, but each time I stopped myself. I did not have enough information. What I had was suspicion, supported by a single document and a growing sense of unease. That was not enough to challenge him directly. Instead, I chose to watch. Throughout the day, I paid closer attention than I ever had before. Daniel and Rebecca moved through the house with the same rhythm, but now I noticed the details beneath it. The way their conversation softened when I entered a room. The quick glances exchanged between them. The unfinished sentences that seemed to disappear when I came within hearing distance. None of it was obvious. That was what made it difficult to ignore. That evening, I decided to ask again, but carefully. Daniel was in the living room, his attention fixed on his laptop. I approached him with the same calm tone I had used before, asking about the accounts and mentioning that I had not reviewed any statements in some time. He looked up briefly, then back at the screen, as if the conversation required only minimal attention. He assured me everything was under control. There was no hesitation in his voice, but there was something else. A subtle firmness that suggested the topic was not open for discussion. When I mentioned that I might want to look at the documents myself, he responded quickly, almost too quickly, explaining that it would only complicate things. Rebecca joined the conversation then, her tone gentle but decisive. She said that managing financial details could be stressful and that it was better if I focused on settling into the house. The words were polite, but their meaning was clear. I was being guided away from involvement. I did not argue. Instead, I nodded, allowing the conversation to end naturally. On the surface, nothing had changed, but internally, the confirmation was unmistakable. That night, I returned to my room and placed the statement on the desk in front of me. The numbers were the same as before, but they felt heavier now. I studied the document more carefully, paying attention to details I had overlooked earlier. The transfer was still pending. That fact settled into my thoughts with quiet significance. Whatever was happening had not yet been completed. There was still time to understand it, and possibly to stop it. I sat there for a long time thinking about Thomas. He had always insisted on knowing exactly what he was signing, exactly what he was agreeing to. He never assumed anything, especially when it came to money. I had done the opposite. But that did not mean I had to continue. As I looked at the statement, a new thought began to form. If I wanted answers, I would need to look beyond this house. I would need someone who could see what I could not. And for the first time since I found the document, I understood what my next step needed to be. If you're questioning what you would do in her place right now, comment 4 below to stay with me, because the next step she takes will quietly set everything in motion. Now, let's move on to Chapter 5. The decision I made that night did not feel dramatic. It felt necessary. The next morning, after the house settled into its usual routine, I sat at the small desk in my room and searched for a name I had not thought about in years. Harold Bennett had once been a patient of mine, a quiet man with a habit of asking precise questions even when he was the one receiving care. Over time, I learned he had spent most of his career investigating financial fraud. He had a way of observing details others ignored. When I found his number, I hesitated only briefly before calling. He recognized my name after a moment, and I explained my situation as clearly as I could, focusing on facts rather than feelings. I told him about the statement, the pending transfer, and the fact that I had not personally authorized anything. He listened without interrupting, then suggested we meet in person. We chose a small office space he occasionally used for consultations. It was quiet, simple, and removed from anything that might attract attention. When I arrived, he greeted me with the same calm professionalism I remembered. I handed him the statement without explanation. He read it slowly, his expression unchanged. When he finished, He asked a series of questions: who had access to the accounts, whether I had signed any documents recently, how long someone else had been managing my finances. I answered each one honestly. The more I spoke, the clearer something became. I had not been involved in any meaningful way. Harold leaned back slightly, studying the document again. He explained that the transaction itself was not unusual in structure, but the context surrounding it raised concerns. He pointed out that large transfers like this rarely happened in isolation. They were often the final step in a series of smaller movements. He asked if I had reviewed any statements over the past year. I had not. That answer seemed to confirm something for him. He explained that funds could be moved gradually through linked accounts, often under the authority of someone managing them. On paper, everything could appear legitimate, especially if the person initiating the transactions had legal access. But authorization and awareness were not the same thing. The distinction settled heavily in my mind. He showed me how the pending transfer might connect to earlier activity, how it could represent a consolidation of funds that had already been repositioned. The numbers on the page were no longer abstract. They formed a pattern. And that pattern did not include me. Harold remained careful in his wording. He did not make accusations. Instead, he focused on what could be confirmed and what still needed to be understood. He emphasized that my lack of direct approval was significant. Without it, the transaction could not be completed properly. That meant something important. There was still time. He advised me not to confront Daniel immediately. Acting without complete information, he explained, could complicate the situation. Instead, he suggested I continue observing and wait for the next step in the process. If the transfer required formal authorization, it would eventually reach me. That was when everything would become clear. I left his office with the sense of clarity I had not felt since this began. The uncertainty was gone. In its place was something quieter, but stronger: understanding. When I returned to the house, nothing had changed on the surface. The same routines continued, the same conversations filled the rooms. But I saw it all differently now. I was no longer guessing. I was waiting. The days after my meeting with Harold passed without any visible change, yet everything felt different. I moved through the house as I always had, keeping my routine steady, my tone calm, my presence predictable. But beneath that surface, I was no longer uncertain. I was waiting. Daniel and Rebecca did not know that. Their conversations became easier to recognize once I knew what to listen for. It was not what they said openly, but what slipped through in quieter moments. A word here, a phrase there, timing, processing, deadline. Each fragment aligned with what Harold had explained, forming a pattern that was no longer abstract. One afternoon, as I passed by the living room, I heard Rebecca ask a question in a lowered voice. She wanted to know if everything would be ready soon. Daniel responded without hesitation. He said that once the authorization was submitted, the rest would move quickly. That word stayed with me. Authorization. It confirmed what I already suspected. The final step depended on me. Everything they had done so far led to that single moment, and they believed it would happen exactly as they expected. I returned to my room and sat quietly for a long time. I did not feel fear. What I felt was clarity. The situation was no longer unfolding unpredictably. It was moving toward a specific point, and I understood where that point was. The next morning, the moment arrived. The envelope was waiting on the table when I came into the kitchen. I recognized the return address immediately. This time, I did not hesitate. I picked it up before anyone else could reach it and carried it with me to my room. I closed the door and opened it carefully. Inside were several pages, structured and formal, filled with language that carried weight even before it was fully understood. The title confirmed everything: This was an authorization for the transfer I had seen referenced in the earlier statement. I read each line slowly. The amount was the same. The structure was exactly as Harold had described. Most of the document had already been completed, including Daniel's role in initiating the request. Only one part remained unfinished: my signature. I placed the papers on the desk and looked at them for a long time. It was a simple action, one that could be completed in seconds. If I had not known what I knew, I might have signed it without question. That thought lingered longer than I expected. I returned the documents to the envelope and left them where they could be found. That evening, Daniel came home with a different kind of energy. It was subtle, but noticeable. He asked about the mail with a tone that suggested he already knew the answer. When I told him there had been something from the bank, he moved quickly to retrieve it. He opened the envelope and glanced through the pages, then placed them in front of me. He described them as routine, something that needed to be completed so everything could be finalized. Rebecca stood nearby, watching quietly. I picked up the document and read it again, even though I already knew every detail. The room felt still, as if both of them were holding their breath without realizing it. I reached for the pen. For a moment, everything remained exactly as they expected. Then I set the pen down. I looked at Daniel, meeting his eyes without hesitation. "I think we should talk before I sign anything." The shift in the room was immediate. It was not loud. There was no raised voice or sudden movement, but something changed in the space between us. The certainty that had guided them until that moment was gone. In its place was something else. Uncertainty. If you're realizing the truth is deeper than it first appeared, comment 6 below to let me know you're still following closely, because the choice she makes next will shift the balance completely. Now, let's move on to Chapter 7. The silence, set the pen down, lingered longer than I expected. It was not uncomfortable in the usual sense. It was heavier than that, as if something had shifted in the room that none of us could ignore. Daniel was the first to speak. His voice was calm, but there was a strain beneath it that had not been there before. He repeated what he had said earlier, that the document was routine, that it was simply part of managing things properly. The words sounded familiar, but now they felt carefully placed rather than natural. I did not respond immediately. Instead, I looked at the document again, allowing the moment to stretch. When I finally spoke, I asked him to explain what exactly the transfer would do. My tone remained steady, without accusation. He hesitated. It was brief, almost imperceptible, but it was enough. Rebecca stepped forward before he could answer fully. She explained that the adjustment would make everything easier to manage, that it would simplify the structure of the accounts and create stability for the household. Her voice carried confidence, but it also carried something else. It sounded rehearsed. I listened without interrupting. When she finished, I asked a simple question. How does this benefit me directly? For the first time, neither of them answered right away. Daniel shifted his weight slightly, his expression tightening. He began to explain that everything in the household was connected, that financial decisions affected all of us. He spoke about long-term planning and responsibility, about making sure things remained stable. The words were logical, but they did not answer the question I had asked. I repeated it, quietly. This time, Daniel did not try to redirect. Instead, he exhaled and admitted that the transfer would help relieve pressure. He did not use the word debt, but it was there in the way he spoke, in the way his voice lowered at the end of the sentence. That was when everything became clear, in a way that no document could have explained. This was not about managing my finances for my benefit. It was about using them to solve a problem that was not mine. Rebecca tried to regain control of the conversation. She emphasized that it was still about the family, that everything they were doing was meant to keep things secure. The phrase sounded familiar, but now it felt different. It no longer carried reassurance. It carried intention. I thought about the dinner table, about the moment Daniel had said I ate there for free. At the time, I had not responded. Now, I understood that it had not been a careless comment. It had been a reflection of how he saw the situation. I mentioned it quietly. Daniel looked away. He said he had not meant it the way it sounded, but he did not deny that it came from frustration. That acknowledgement, small as it was, confirmed what I already knew. The pressure he was under had changed the way he saw me. For a moment, none of us spoke. Then I said something I had not planned to say, but that felt necessary. I told him that trust did not mean silence, that helping someone did not mean giving up the right to understand what was being done. Rebecca's composure shifted slightly. It was subtle, but it was there. The conversation was no longer moving in the direction she had expected. Daniel leaned forward, his tone more direct now. He asked if I trusted him. It was a simple question, but it did not have a simple answer. I told him that I trusted him enough to ask questions. The distinction mattered. The room grew quiet again, but this time the silence felt different. It was not uncertain. It was defined. I placed the document back on the table between us and told him I was not going to sign it. There was no anger in my voice, no hesitation, just clarity. And in that moment, I saw something change in Daniel's expression. The confidence he had carried into the conversation was gone. In its place was something else. The realization that things were no longer under his control. The days that followed our conversation settled into a quiet kind of distance. Nothing was openly wrong, yet nothing felt the same. The house continued its routines, but something underneath had shifted in a way that could not be undone. Daniel spoke less. When he did, his words were measured, as though he was choosing them carefully before saying them aloud. He no longer dismissed my presence, but he no longer moved around me with the same confidence either. There was hesitation where there had once been certainty. Rebecca changed in a different way. She remained composed, but her control became more visible. Her routines tightened, her tone more deliberate. She no longer corrected me as often, but the absence of those corrections did not feel like acceptance. It felt like distance. I watched them both, not with suspicion anymore, but with understanding. The tension between them became noticeable in small moments, brief exchanges that ended too quickly, glances that carried more weight than words. Whatever had been planned before was no longer certain, and that uncertainty had settled into the space between them. I began thinking more seriously about my place in the house. For a long time, I had believed that staying there was the best choice for all of us. Now, I understood that my presence had become part of the problem, not because I had done anything wrong, but because the balance had changed in a way that could not be repaired simply by ignoring it. The idea of leaving did not come suddenly. It formed slowly, shaped by clarity rather than emotion. I still had resources. I still had the ability to live on my own. What I had lost was not independence, but the awareness that I still possessed it. One evening, Daniel came to speak with me alone. His posture was different, less certain, more reflective. He admitted that things had gone further than he intended. He spoke about pressure, about responsibility, about trying to hold everything together. I listened. When he finished, I told him that understanding his reasons did not change what had happened. That explanation was not the same as honesty. He did not argue. For the first time, he admitted that he had avoided telling me the truth because he expected I would refuse. That admission did not surprise me, but hearing it spoken aloud gave it weight. I told him then that the trust would remain exactly as it was. He nodded. Then I told him something else. I was going to move out. The words settled between us without resistance. He looked surprised, but not entirely shocked. He said it was not necessary, that I could stay, that things could be worked out. I explained that this was not about necessity. It was about restoring something that had been lost. Respect. I told him I was not leaving the family. I was simply stepping out of a situation that no longer felt balanced. He did not try to stop me again, and in that quiet understanding, I felt something return that I had not realized I was missing. A sense of myself. If you feel the story is reaching something real and unavoidable, comment 8 below so I know you're still here. Because what comes next is not just an ending, it's the truth she finally chooses. Now let's move on to the final outcome. The morning I began packing, the house was unusually quiet. I moved slowly, not because I was unsure, but because I wanted to be deliberate. Each item I placed into the suitcase felt like a small decision, a quiet acknowledgement of what I was choosing to carry forward and what I was leaving behind. I did not take much. Clothes, a few personal documents, a photograph of my husband that had remained beside my bed. Everything else stayed where it was. Rebecca passed by the doorway once, offering a polite nod. Her tone had softened in recent days, but it remained distant, as though we were no longer part of the same rhythm. There were no objections, no attempts to change my decision, only a quiet acceptance that things had shifted beyond repair. Daniel lingered longer. He stood near the hallway as I closed my suitcase, his expression carrying something heavier than frustration. There was regret there, though he did not say it directly. He asked if I had everything I needed. I told him I did. The children reacted differently. They did not understand the reasons, only the change. Their questions were simple, their concern unguarded. I reassured them gently, explaining that I was not leaving them, only moving to a place of my own. They accepted it in the way children often do, with trust rather than full comprehension. When I stepped outside, the air felt different, not lighter, but clearer. My new home was smaller, located near the coast, where the sound of the water carried through the open windows. It was not grand, but it was mine. The space held no expectations, no quiet calculations, no unspoken tensions, only possibility. The first evening, I sat by the window and watched the light fade over the horizon. For the first time in a long while, there was no need to measure my presence against anyone else's needs. The trust remained intact, exactly as it had been designed. My finances were no longer something managed around me, but by me. From a distance, I thought about Daniel, not with anger, but with understanding. His struggles had not disappeared, but they were no longer mine to solve. What remained between us was not broken, just changed. And in that change, I found something steady, myself. In the quiet of my new home, I began to understand the story differently. At first, I thought it was about a single moment, a sentence spoken at a dinner table, a document placed in front of me, a decision to say no. But the more I sat with it, the more I realized that nothing about it had been sudden. It had all happened slowly. Trust had not been broken in one action. It had shifted in small ways, through assumptions, through silence, through the belief that love would always make things right without needing to be questioned. I had trusted my son, and in many ways, that trust was not misplaced. But I had also stopped asking questions, and that silence had allowed something important to change without my noticing. Daniel had not set out to harm me. He had been under pressure. He had been trying to solve problems the only way he believed he could. But somewhere along the way, the line between what was helpful and what was fair became unclear. And when that happens, intention no longer protects the outcome. I thought often about my husband. He had never explained the details of the trust to me, not fully. At the time, I thought it was because he trusted our son completely. Now I understood something different. He trusted him, but he also understood that life changes people. Pressure changes people. And he wanted to make sure that no matter what happened, I would never lose the ability to make my own decisions. That was what he protected, not money, dignity. There is a quiet kind of strength in asking questions, in pausing before agreeing, in recognizing that trust does not mean surrendering your voice. I had not lost that strength. I had simply forgotten to use it. Now, I would not forget again. What remains between Daniel and me is still there, but it is different. It rests on something clearer, something more honest, and whatever happens next will not be built on silence. Because I have learned something I will carry with me for the rest of my life. Dignity is not given, it is protected. Some stories do not end with loud victories or dramatic conclusions. Instead, they settle into something quieter, something deeper, an understanding that grows only after everything has changed. Life has a way of revealing truths slowly, often through moments we wish had never happened. But within those moments, there is clarity. There is the realization that respect must stand beside love, that silence is not always peace, and that dignity is something we must protect, even when it feels uncomfortable to do so. In the end, what matters is not what was taken or lost, but what was finally understood. And sometimes, the strongest choice is simply to stand still, speak honestly, and choose yourself. Thank you for being here and listening. If this story resonated with you, share your thoughts in the comments, and do not forget to follow and subscribe for more stories like this.